I'll introduce myself for now. Scano Srinigaso Gaiga Hononi Quenzoda Otunigishoda. Hi everyone. It's so nice to be here tonight. My name is Serena Mendizábal and I'm Kugel Wolf Clan from Six Nations of the Grand River, as well as Panamanian from down south. And yeah, I've grown up on Six Nations territory my whole life. I'm a Haudenosaunee woman. And so Dominique was when she was giving her land acknowledgement, I'm one of those few nations that occupies most of Ontario. And so, yeah, I'm really happy to be here. I'm the Just Transition Manager at Sacred Earth Solar, where I focus on our Just Transition programming, specifically from projects to education and training to advocacy and policy. And I've been here for about 2 years now, which is really exciting. And I guess I'll just touch on my background too a little bit. Oh, perfect. Um, I'll
Yeah.
touch on my background and then I'll share Melina's presentation with
Yeah.
everyone. And I can be the person. Um, you'll just have to tell me next slide, unfortunately. So my bad. Yeah, I have a master's of geography and environment with a specific focus in Indigenous health and environment. And my background comes really looking at industrial health impacts on Indigenous communities from industry, such as pulp and paper mills, pipelines, renewable energy, and how that impacts our health physically, but also mentally, emotionally, spiritually. I started working in renewable energy when I was 18. And I saw a lot of like non-consensual development still going on, and I didn't want it to keep replicating the harm. And really the big question that made me go into my master's after working in my community was, what is actually going to make my community healthy? And that's where I ended up working on a lot of this focus around industrial health impacts, and actually how I found myself at Sacred Earth Solar, because I really believe our projects have that focus of health and well-being and healing and culture and sovereignty. And that's what my whole master's thesis actually finished with. Sovereignty is what makes us healthy, sovereignty over our territories. We can't be healthy without sovereignty. And so, yeah, I'm really grateful to be part of Sacred Earth Solar because I feel like we're actually putting those words into action. And so, nice to meet you all. And I'm going to pass it over to Melina. I'm just going to share screen on the presentation. And I hope I don't have the same sticky note problem. So, just let me know if I do or not.
Okay, fingers crossed. Yeah.
Can you guys see okay? Everything?
Looks good. Looks good on my end. Yeah.
Okay. I'm
Okay.
going to mute myself.
Okay.
But I'll pass it to you, Melina.
Okay, thank you. So yeah, part of what Serena said too was just rebuilding healthier communities and what is that intersection of health and energy. And I think a lot of times we don't think of energy as having that impact unless you're from an impacted community and you have to live with those burdens of impact for energy and how we flip on the very lights that we live with every day and how that impacts communities, and some burden the cost of that, and it affects the very health of what brings us into a lot of times hospitals. But that's not really spoken about. So we try to bring that connection and that intersection into these conversations. So next slide, Serena. So really quickly, I'm Laboucan Cree. I am from a small Indigenous community that is in Northern Alberta. And I'll talk a little bit about the impacts on our communities and my community and my own body. I am a founder of Indigenous Climate Action and co-founder of Indigenous Climate and founder of Sacred Earth Solar. Next slide. And so just to locate myself as an Indigenous person, I was born in the Northern Boreal Forest, in the northern lungs of Mother Earth, as we like to call it, which is in all across the Boreal, goes all the way across the Earth. Some places are more deforested than not, but where I was born and where I was raised in the North, it was very beautiful and pristine at the time of my birth, but it has decreased dramatically because of ecological impact and tar sands, oil, gas, logging, fracking, extraction. And I come from the small Cree community, Laboucan-Massimo is our language. And we still have culture camps on the land every year. And that's my dad actually in the north, in the top quadrant. And he's there as a child, and he was hidden from residential schools. He was hidden by my kukum, my grandmother there on the bottom left with me as a child. And so he avoided some of the brunt of those massive impacts that many of us and many, I'd say, newcomers and also Canadians are learning about of basically the you saw on the news probably a number of years back where bodies of Indigenous children were being found in unmarked graves. And so that's the legacy of a lot of my kukum, and not my kukum, but my aunties and uncles that went to residential schools, including my dad went to a residential day school. Next slide. So our homelands in the tar sands, so this impact to health, which is related to energy. I was born in the left kind of splotch is Peace River country. Next slide. It's one of the largest impact zones on the planet. And what we are experiencing there is cultural and environmental genocide. And you'll see this throughout the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, where we've seen further encroachment, contamination, destruction of our homelands, resulting in a loss of culture, tradition, and customs. If you go to the next slide, you'll see just the type of landscapes that's being replaced by drained and polluted watersheds and contaminated air. So as you can imagine, air quality is a huge impact to our lungs and to our ability to breathe, and just all of the other health impacts that we internalize to be around close to these facilities. Next slide. I won't have time to talk about it today, but it is kind of one of the foundational reasons of why I wanted to start Sacred Earth was because of a massive oil spill that was right beside my family's homes and in my community where I was born. You can go and look it up on YouTube. Look up oil on Laboucan land, and it talks about one of the biggest at the time oil spills in Alberta and Canada's history. And my family couldn't breathe, their eyes were burning, their stomachs were turning. And so these types of impacts are very real, it's not just something you read about or something that, is in the news, but it's the very people that are burning the impacts for our ability to put gas in our car. Next slide. If you don't know, it's worth looking up, but there has been some tar sands impacts on Indigenous health. There's been a community health study that was put out by Fort Chipewyan through Alberta Health Services at the community saying, please, communities are literally dying of cancer. So there was a study. It was really hard for the community to even get that study done because a lot of times industry and unfortunately the Alberta government has hidden the impacts away from but scientists recorded cancers such as bile duct tract, blood and lymphatic cancers, lung cancers in women, and soft tissue cancer, all occurring at higher rates than expected. Next slide. So again, these have been long ignored of the toxic contamination of downstream communities. And it wasn't until many of us were basically raising the alarm bell, traveling across the country, lobbying, speaking about doing teach-ins like this, going to Europe, doing divestment tours, getting investors to divest, to be able to really say, this is not okay to continue to this is environmental racism at its fullest. This is what people are experiencing, but it's been ignored, even though a multitude has expressed their concern. Next slide. Just to give you an example, I became bedridden after working not in the tar sands, but campaigning against the tar sands, but was exposed to high levels of petrochemicals, so toxic, industrial toxicants. So this is a blood test that I did after becoming very ill. And yeah, going up to the 75th percentile. And next slide. Also showing different types of chemicals made from the processing of petroleum. So these types of things, I have 17 markers in my body. So this is a very real thing. This isn't something that people are just saying anecdotally. It's actually studied and shown through people getting quite sick. Next slide. And so, we talk about Truth and Reconciliation Commission, and I feel like that word is tossed around a lot. It's an important thing to happen. And I think the uncovering of history and the exposing of history and all of the different events that took place across the country where Canadians were able to listen to in 2015 to and before, when there's volumes, so you can actually read, there's 6 volumes in the Truth and Reconciliation Commission when it was released in 2016, but it's story after story after story of thousands of residential schools of what they went through. And so it's hard to we say we're in a process of reconciliation, but when we have the ongoing grievances like what's happening in the tar sands where communities are still literally dying from environmental toxins, are we actually in a reconciliation process where, if you say sorry but you keep continuing the harm, is that actually reconciliation or resolution? Next slide. So in this context, we're talking about today is what does a just transition actually look like to renewable energy or to, newer parts of being able to transition our energy systems. Next slide. So for us, it looks like rebuilding safer communities, doing community-based energy projects, food security, returning to land, AKA land back movements, and what that means in a variety and multitudes of different ways, and supporting Indigenous frontlines that are actually protecting their homelands from more harm. Next slide. So this project I put up as a part of my master's thesis back in 2015, and it was the foundational project of Laboucan Solar, which turned into Sacred Earth Solar. And it was a project that I really wanted to see in my community because, after a massive oil spill and just seeing my family not being able to breathe and everyone feeling sick and they having to shut down the community school for a number of weeks because teachers were so sick that they couldn't even teach the students, we decided to build this project. It's a 20.8 kilowatt system and it powers our health center. And there is a video on the next slide that will show you really quick. Oh yeah, and really quick, this is Carlton. He was 21, he's from the community, and this is the first time the community ever saw solar panels in their community. And that's what we mean around just transition, is that communities that are actually burdening the brunt of environmental degradation and climate change, are they able to even access technology and afford technology that can help them transition from what they're completely surrounded with, which is like what my community is surrounded with. Do they even have a choice? A lot of times we're economic hostages, are not able to transition from one form of energy to another because we're kind of surrounded by it and there's no alternative a lot of the time. So trying to build the alternatives is a part of what Sacred Earth Solar does. Next slide. Yeah, this is the final installation. Again, it's by the community school. So kindergarten to grade 12 will see this installation for their whole lives, where before solar wasn't even really understood, or, maybe still isn't, but we do climate literacy engagements and we'll actually go back again this year and into next to do more engagements. Next slide. Now here the video is.
Okay, just give me a thumbs up if you can hear it, everyone.
Okay. I can hear it, but you might have to stop again for if you stop share, Serena, and maybe click off those volume optimization check marks before you share screen.
Sorry, everyone. It's sometimes because I'm not just sharing the video this time and I'm sharing a PowerPoint. My apologies. Yeah, yes, I'll open it in YouTube and see.
Okay.
Most people have no clue that in 2023, the best way to make money on Amazon is.
I was like, YouTube is talking to us. Oh yeah. Did you optimize the sound before you to share screen?
Sorry, that option isn't showing as usual, but
Indigenous peoples have.
no, okay. You can hear this time?
I can.
Yes, yeah,
My apologies. It wasn't showing up.
no worries, no worries.
The Laboucan Cree have been here since time immemorial. Indigenous peoples have a very intimate connection with our homelands here in Northern Alberta. And what we've seen instead is industry coming and essentially taking over our lands and really exploiting them, and it's had a detrimental impact. We see companies digging down into the earth, trying to extract the very last drop of oil. But instead, we can start looking up. We're bathing in sunlight all around us, and yet we don't utilize that energy. And so that's why our community has decided to install solar. Pretty amazing to see this project go up. A lot of the community members and the young people are working, they're getting hands-on training right now. It's really amazing to see how proud people are of it and how it's a community project, because all of this has been through the blood, sweat, and tears of the community.
This project matters to us because it kind of represents who we are and where we're going in the future. When you see the work, I can say that I did that. I took part and I did it right. There'll be a lot of people seeing it every day. I can tell people I worked on this.
I know in a lot of the ceremonies and the songs, the sun is praised. Even the project name, Ita Pan, means the coming of the dawn. And it's coming of a new era, era where we use, energy that's not devastating to our environment. In getting this solar project going, we are leaders in solar power. And that's what we're teaching our youth. They have to learn how to operate it. They have to learn how to maintain it. And they already know how to set it up. So if any of our neighbors in the surrounding First Nations or Métis settlements want to start a solar power, we can be there to help them get it going.
Thanks, Serena. And yeah, if you want to see it in its full effect, you can look up Just Transition Solar on our YouTube webpage. So yeah, it's hard with the sound sometimes in Zoom, but ONE-IIOE Collective, we've done, so after that project, we did a number of projects across the country and are still implementing projects, which actually Serena will speaking to more after this, but I'll just mention one here. But we have built projects in Secwepemc territory, in Giddon Dam territory, in Wet'suwet'en territory, in Fairy Creek. But this one we also did with ONE-IIOE Collective with Christy Belcourt and Isaac Murdoch, which is in Northern Ontario, to help solarize a studio art building, which helps bring, and also a language revitalization camp, which brings back the Anishinaabe language. If you go to the next slide. Also wanted to quickly mention, this is another resource that would be great potentially if you want to learn more about Indigenous issues across the country and kind of issues around energy, but also colonialism and colonial impacts and policy, and then also kind of the solutions that communities are driving. And it's really a 22-minute jam-packed episodes of 13 episodes, and you can actually find it on the Weather Network. So if you go to the next slide, see here, you can go to, it's airing on the Weather Network. It's also airing on the Aboriginal People's Television Network and also on the Knowledge Network. But we went from coast to coast to visit communities across the country. We went to Gull Bay First Nation. We went to 6 Nations of the Grand River, where Serena's from, and she can speak a bit more about that. And I can also show a quick video. If you go to the next slide, we went to 13 places like Kanaka Bar. We went to Lishtagush, Quebec, which is Mi'kmaq communities, implementing wind and food security. So many different projects, community projects that have communities addressing the climate crisis and also addressing community issues within their own community.
We'll play this one real quick. Energy power plant. This is right beside a decommissioned coal energy power plant, and now we're seeing solar being erected in its place. How do you feel about that? What's the story behind that?
Ontario Power Generation decommissioned Nanacoke Generating Station in 2013. And now Nanacoke Solar is actually taking place on the former coal yard of the Nanacoke Generating Station. And they're really
Transitioning, hey?
into that greener energy.
Even though we see a refinery in the background still pumping oil, I think we see this is like really the energy transition that we're all really hoping for. And I think it's pretty inspiring that Six Nations is a part of it. This is. And then another quick short video I'll share. But yeah, I really encourage people to go. But this community is in, as out in the Gaspé Peninsula and in Gaspé-Gawagi, where 3 Mi'kmaq communities came together to create a joint venture, and they put up 47 wind turbines and built this amazing project where they trained community members to become wind turbine technicians, and also has an amazing other great thing about it, which has revenue generating for the community. So in the next 20 years, it will generate over $200 million for the community. So let's watch this really quick short video here. So how long have you both worked here for?
About 2.5
Great.
years.
And what did you do before for working?
I worked in on diesel mechanics, motors and stuff like that before, but then I went into the electrical
So
field.
you basically transitioned from a non-renewable energy field to a renewable energy field.
Yes.
That's so cool. And you came from,
I used to work in forestry. I did about 5 years in forestry. And I took an electrical course. Yeah, let us show you inside.
okay, perfect. How tall is it?
It's a 100-meter tower, 330 feet in the cell. Right now, we're gonna be working on this cabinet.
Oh,
We're actually gonna be replacing our Bachman module, which is essentially the brain of the turbine. So we can make communication with the turbine.
so brain surgery essentially.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
The reason why we replaced this module is because there was no communication from the computer to the turbine.
Mhm.
So that's how we knew it was something to do with the module.
So you're like wind doctors essentially. So you have to make a prognosis and then fix it.
My favorite thing about being up here is the view. If you take a look around, like it's amazing. Like you can see so far. We're 100 meters in the air right now. We always learn new things every day.
What you do every day, it's pretty amazing to see the capacity or high level of skills that you're bringing to your nation. You must be pretty proud. Yeah, so unfortunately the sound isn't showing, but yeah, I definitely recommend people to go and watch
A
more.
year ago, I first talked about the Aeromine rooftop wind turbine and its unique motionless design. Now,
Sorry.
That's all. It's just YouTube trying to colonize. So how, yeah, and that brings us into how do we decolonize? So in this process of the Truth and Reconciliation, a lot of that comes with how do we decolonize, and a lot of Indigenous communities and also settler people and allies that we work with also ask these questions, because the colonial project of Canada has been so detrimental and has negative consequences and impact to not only Indigenous peoples, but also the lands and territories of our peoples. And now, unfortunately, after 150 years of hyper colonialism and also hypercapitalism, we see, unfortunately, immense the climate crisis that a lot of us have worked to try to stop, but it's really hard when, 15 years ago, many people didn't even believe in the climate crisis, even when we were working on it. And we were gaslit a lot of times for working on climate issues, even back then. And now we feel like, we're kind of in this impact, kind of irreparable potential cliff right now. And so, a part of that is looking at what are our cultural values, what are the colonial values that are inherent to this country, and what should we think about and possibly decolonize. And so go to the next slide. For me, and also many Indigenous peoples around the world, we are talking to people
in all parts of the world around needing a critical paradigm shift where, you know, for an Indigenous worldview, we know and we hold that all life is sacred, that we have a reciprocal and intimate relationship with Mother Earth. And with that comes a sacred responsibility to protect her. And that's why you see so many Indigenous peoples on the front lines trying to protect Mother Earth, not just for their own communities, but for all of humanity, or two-legged ones, as we call them. Next slide. And so for us, we say it's a sacred circle, or we say it's a sacred hoop, where, you know, all living beings are one and all interrelated, interdependent, and we're not in a pyramid colonial triangle that a lot of times is pyramid, as if humans are up here, and the rest of any species is down here. It's actually this way, and we're all part of that sacred hoop. And that's an inherent Indigenous value. Next slide. And so for us, you know, unfortunately, a lot of settlers and people that are engaging with Indigenous communities see the aftermath of Indigenous peoples going through 150 years of intense colonial project and intense colonial impact and policy, again, that I said is detrimental. And so but we actually have a much more holistic approach to health in our traditional governance systems and our traditional ways of being that includes so many different things, again, on that sacred hoop. Next slide. And we say, that's why we say healing is justice, and that is connected to, you know, affordable health, accessible health, dignified health, access to dignified healthcare. And I'm going to leave you with a couple of the TRC recommendations. But I guess the last thing I will say is, if you just go back, decolonization is, you know, a personal process. It's personal for every single person that benefits from colonialism here in this country. It is a systemic process, and that's a part of why the Truth and Reconciliation process started. And it's also a collective process. It's not just individual, but it's also collective. So we can begin to decolonize by learning the true histories here of this country and understand the lasting impacts that have been invisibilized in this country, understanding your location, understanding histories of the society that you're living in, understand, you know, what actual history took place on the land that you currently live in and you benefit from, and how does this impact every structure of society that you're a part of? This is a part of decolonizing. Next slide. And so I'll leave you with these TRC recommendations, and I definitely encourage everyone to look it up. You can easily access this online, look up Truth and Reconciliation Canada, and there is recommendations. And so I picked out the recommendations ones that I found for health. And so the current state, this is the TRC recommendation number 18. The current state of Indigenous health in Canada is a direct result of previous Canadian government policies, including residential schools, and it's critical to recognize and implement the healthcare rights of Indigenous peoples as identified in international, constitutional, and under the treaties. Next slide. Also recommendation number 19, there is no need to close the gap in health outcomes between Indigenous and non-Indigenous communities. Such efforts should include health indicators on infant mortality, maternal health, suicide, mental health, life expectancy, chronic disease, illness, and injury incidences, and the ability to access appropriate health services. Next slide, which is really hard in an Indigenous community often, or just being Indigenous in the city. Recommendation 21, health authorities and all levels of government should provide sustainable funding for existing/new Indigenous healing centers to address the physical, mental, emotional, and spiritual harms caused by residential schools. Next slide. 22, we call upon those who can affect change within the Canadian healthcare system to recognize the value of Indigenous healing practices and use them in the treatment of Indigenous patients in collaboration with Indigenous healers and elders when requested by Indigenous patients. Next slide. And 23, increase and support the number of working Indigenous professionals working in the healthcare system to ensure the retention of Indigenous healthcare providers in Indigenous communities. And also 23, provide cultural competency training for all healthcare professionals. And pretty sure this is the last one, but 24, we call upon medical and nursing schools in Canada to require all students to take a course dealing with Indigenous health issues, including the history and legacy of residential schools, United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, treaties and Aboriginal rights, and all rights, and also Indigenous teachings and practices. And let's see here. Yeah, and so that's my presentation, and we'll pass it. And yeah, follow us on Instagram or on Facebook, on Twitter. And yeah, just follow our work if you want to learn more about the work that we're doing. And I will pass it over to Serena. Thank you so much for listening.
Thank you, Melina. I will just be 1 second to share my screen again. Okay. Amazing. Can everyone see that okay?
Yes, no square box.
Perfect. So yeah, I just wanted to further talk about Sacred Earth Solar. And as I mentioned earlier, I have worked with Sacred Earth Solar for about 2 years now. And a lot of this work came in myself trying to find like what is actually going to make our communities healthy. A lot of my work was around health impacts and what we were already facing. And so to further into that, what could I do for communities beyond that that would really support, and also what would align with our cultural values and the protection of the land and the environment, something very interconnected to us because we can't be healthy without our lands or environment, and when our lands aren't healthy, we aren't healthy. And so I kind of already got in a little bit about myself, but I will touch on that I previously worked at Six Nations of the Grand River Development Corporation. And I worked in the beginning part of our projects. And a lot of what I was seeing was the transition work. And so I just want to touch on the one project that Melina highlighted, Empower the People, because that solar farm was actually placed in a decommissioned coal power plant. And that was the Nanticoke coal power plant, which is half an hour from my community, and was one of the top 10 factors of the largest bouts of emissions within the country when it was operational. And so that had a severe health impact on my community. And also to mention, just even Six Nations as a whole, we're completely surrounded by urbanization. And from housing development to pipelines, I'm pretty sure it's line 5 right through our community, to many different industrial impacts that our community is facing, and we currently can see that within our own people today. And so yeah, a lot of this work, as you just heard Melina, comes from our community and our people, and what really pushes us to do this. And so yeah, I've been lucky enough to work at Sacred Earth Solar. We're an Indigenous women-led organization that empowers frontline communities, cultural communities, ceremonial communities with renewable energy and healing justice, as well as all climate solutions, education, training. We really focus our work on the basis of our relationships and ones that we hold with community members all across Turtle Island. And I've been lucky enough to be able to work with communities while I've been here in supporting this vision for a healthier future. And so this is just some pictures from the first project that I put up with Sacred Earth Solar. It was with No More Silence, a MMIW organization out of Toronto, and that focuses on supporting families of MMIW survivors and LGBTQ and disabled Indigenous community members in the urban city. And so a lot of their work focuses on supporting urban community members in Toronto with ceremony, but they would do the strawberry ceremony for the last 14 years, I believe. And that was a one time a year ceremony. And so what they really wanted was something sustainable and something that had longevity to it, and that was on a more consistent basis for the members for the participants and the people that they were really supporting. And so they created the Hummingbird Healing Lodge, it's an accessible sweat lodge that people, disabled and LGBTQ members, are able to access for year-round ceremony. and Sacred Earth Solar was lucky enough to support with the solarization. And we have another video on this, which we'll talk more about in the video. So I'm just gonna let that play. And I'm really hoping the audio works. It's being real finicky. I'm gonna share screen again. Like, yeah, it usually has, sorry everyone, it usually has the optimization portion, and then it's not showing up as frequent. Okay.
Every project that Sacred Earth Solar puts up is personal and it's relational, but this project really lies very close to home because my family has a murdered and missing Indigenous women where my sister's case is still unsolved. And we've had a close relationship as a family with No More Silence for over a decade.
So it's been a really long road to get here, but we have our Hummingbird Healing Lodge. And it has been an incredible past 6-7 months of sweats with community members who have really had incredible experiences here.
We want to prioritize trans two-spirit people with disabilities. Obviously, that's part of our mandate is to be able to access them. And getting back to the reason why No More Silence was started in the first place, to provide healing and respite for the families of the missing and murdered.
As a murdered and missing Indigenous family member, I've attended the lodge myself, and it felt like it was very prioritized for that.
I witnessed the importance of the project a few months ago when there was a sweat for Melina and her family, and I was really surrounded around healing for the family. And right then I saw what this lodge does, and it was really special to see a family be brought that healing. Over the last, I'd say 6 or more months, Sacred Earth Solar worked along No More Silence to create a solar system on their Hummingbird Healing Lodge.
Building that array has been a fantastic experience. We had a lot of fun.
Yay! For the months we worked with solar contractors to put in a solar PV system, as well as wire the entire bunkie that we're currently in right now with electricity.
It looks fantastic. Since we had to cut down a couple of trees in the front yard, but since that's been done, whenever it's sunny, that solar array has pumped out in 5 days more energy than my house uses in a month. So one of the best things about our lodge is that it's accessible to people in a wheelchair. And we've already proven that with having a special accessible sweat in which we had a person who was blind. We put Wanda in on a ramp. She's able to take her wheelchair in and conduct the sweat right inside the sweat lodge.
Bringing back ceremonial spaces has been a really heavy lift for many communities because it was literally illegal in Canada to have these spaces and places. So Sacred Earth Solar thinks it's a major priority for communities to implement healing justice within our organizations, within our communities, within our nations.
I really find it so special that this space in the closest reserve to Toronto can be accessible to us LGBTQ+, for persons with disabilities, for Indigenous peoples from urban centers. My own family were urban and Indigenous homeless people in Toronto. And I think something like this would have completely changed their lives to have this access to healing. And so, yeah, it's really special to see that we are breaking down those barriers. No More Silence is breaking down those barriers and providing ceremony for people who need it the most.
Communities are protecting their homelands, they're saving seeds, they're bringing back ceremony, they're revitalizing languages, they are literally fighting the impacts of environmental degradation and climate change all at the same time. So with the capacity that Sacred Earth Solar has and the knowledge that we have to be able to build projects and be able to build
solar installations where communities have light, power, heating, electricity, to be able to be on their homelands in their traditional territories, but still have the technology to be able to be in spaces where they're warm, where they feel held and where they feel loved and they feel comfort and they can heal and they can protect and they can revitalize.
Amen.
Try, might be too short.
Just move it over a bit.
Yeah.
No.
My little.
Yes. Yeah.
That video always brings a smile to my face, and I think even in that video you saw the amount of different themes that align within our projects, that our projects really aren't just about lowering emissions, and even the protection of the environment, which it is central to our work, but it's beyond that, and really seeing ourselves as part of the environment and the territories we come from, and that our healing is rooted within the healing of the land. The land can't heal without us being healed. And so it's just one, going back to Melina's, the sacred hoop. It's all very interconnected for us. And so to the next project, the one we're currently working on, as Melina mentioned, yes, we are still working on projects, is with my own ceremonial longhouse, one that my family has been going to since we came to the Grand River, in Six Nations of the Grand River, the Sour Springs Longhouse. Sacred Earth Solar will be supporting them with a sustainable restoration focused on energy efficiency retrofits, which I won't talk about it here, but really, if you're wanting to think about like what is the healthiest part of the transition, it's really those retrofits, because they're not just based on lowering emissions, but they're based on making our spaces and our homes and our buildings healthier with optimal airflow and moisture and heating. But we're also doing a solar PV, a hybrid installation, as well as building a seed storage facility so that we're able to protect and preserve our Haudenosaunee heritage seeds so that we can promote food security as well as ceremony for generations to come. And so this project is very close to my heart. This is Haudenosaunee people. We are the people of the Longhouse, and this is the Longhouse who makes us who we are as the Cayuga Nation. And so yeah, it's just very special. I even have some of my ancestors are buried on these grounds. It's so again, going back to No More Silence, it's that very interconnected nature of our projects. And I just wanted to kind of show some of what we do. From doing the projects and working with contractors, we do a bunch of fundraising. We work with contractors, we look at designs, but we also do a lot of community education and training and building that capacity in our own people so that they'll be able to preserve and operate and maintain their own systems and be autonomous. And so this is just some of the work that we've done so far, because we're actually still putting in the retrofits, we just did an audit. We're going to be putting the solar in the summer, and we're going to be building the seed storage over the next year. But right now we've been doing a lot of community education. We brought 10 young men from my longhouse to do solar installation training, and also as well as different community education sessions. And in that top left, you can see that we've did an update on the electrical wiring, really for that safety and health and safety focus for the projects. Yes, we probably could have put the projects forth without it, but what is going to make this space safe? And it was doing those updates that were much needed over time. And so that's really our priority, is healthy builds, is safe builds, comfortable spaces. As you can see with the No More Science project, as you can see with this project and the other ones that Melina had showed you. And I just want to touch on that Sacred Earth Solar isn't the only organization that is doing this kind of work across the country. We very much do operate within a climate justice focus, though, which I think is what makes Sacred Earth really special. But a lot of other communities across the country are also putting forth projects for this transition, as Indigenous communities are the second largest asset owners of renewable energy in so-called Canada, behind utilities. Right now, Indigenous communities ownership in approximately 300 medium to large projects and approximately 3,000 small scale projects. These numbers change like every day. So if you probably find a new fact, it's probably true because it is increasing as we know it. And so, yeah, Sacred Earth Solar is just one of the many who are putting this work forward to build healthier communities. And through Melina's just profiling about Power to the People, where she went to, I'm pretty sure, 28 different communities across the country, focusing on the plethora of Indigenous renewable energy and food projects and eco housing, she realized that how could I make this knowledge accessible? And what could I do beyond even Power to the People and the television show to promote a just transition, that communities have the power to do this themselves? And that's where the Just Transition Guide comes in, a partnership between Sacred Earth Solar, Indigenous Climate Action, Power to the People, David Suzuki Foundation, and Real World Media. And it is a recently launched in November. The guide is an offering and 180-page resource profiling renewable energy technologies, success stories, policy recommendations towards implementing an equitable transition. And really a key focus of the guide is the wisdom from communities. It is by community for community. And I think that's what makes this really different than a lot of the knowledge we're seeing across the country. Is this is our own people, and we are really promoting that sovereignty and health focus when it comes to these projects and when it comes to this guide. So yeah, if you want to just take a quick picture or of the QR code, you'll be able to find it, but it's also found at sacredearth.solar/just transition guide. And so in the foundation of the guide, a just transition from fossil fuels to renewable energy refers to a social justice framework that considers, prioritizes, and ensures equitable outcomes for workers and communities in the implementation of policies to transition from fossil fuels to sustainable living. And it's really focusing on the fair cost and benefit distribution, focusing on historically oppressed communities such as women, LGBTQIAS2S+, Indigenous peoples, immigrants, and racialized groups, those who have been holding the burden of a lot of the industrial health impacts that we've been seeing across the country. And from an Indigenous perspective, an Indigenous-led transition proposes strategies for creating sustainable, thriving communities with dignified livelihoods and democratic governance. And Indigenous environmental networks, Indigenous principles of a just transition, which if you're looking to explore more is a really amazing resource. They emphasize responsibility, relationships, sovereignty, and transformation in this process, which you've probably heard Melina and myself mention those words a few times throughout today. And so the guide has 7 different sections, and I'm just going to try this. I will not be doing the Just Transition Guide justice with this, and I really think that you must read it to really get the nuance of what is being talked about in this guide. But I want to just provide a summary of it so you can kind of get an idea of what you would be using and reading. So section 1 is really the introduction, focuses on the age of consequence, kind of positioning where we are today to the future we want and what do we want to envision for ourselves and for our communities. Really exploring what a just transition from fossil fuels to renewable energy looks like from an Indigenous perspective, as well as focusing on ongoing challenges within renewable energy, greenwashing, and carbon reductionism, because we must be critical when it comes to this transition. There's a lot of false solutions that are being put forth, as well as even the solutions that our communities want. We just need to be critical and make sure that we are informed when we make these decisions. Section 2 really provides that understanding of energy and electricity systems, and really with that focus on looking at so-called Canada's energy and electricity context. Many people don't understand the grid systems, don't understand where the electricity that's turning their lights on comes from, are very disconnected from what's actually going on in their communities. But for a lot of Indigenous peoples, this is the reality. As you just were watching with Melina's community, they lived that and they felt that within their own health and well-being. And so I think this portion of the guide really provides that context of where electricity and energy is actually coming from in the country. And yeah, we focus on energy generation and grids in so-called Canada. So from those transmission lines to those distribution lines to the big power stations and generating plants, providing giving understanding to that, to the energy conservation and efficiency. How can we use less energy via not using any at all, or by using efficient technologies, and how we can explore those kinds of conversations before we actually go into renewable energy projects. That's really the starting point when it comes to energy conservation and efficiency, to the path forward and looking at community energy systems and designing your own project. Right now, Indigenous involvement is crucial in tackling so-called Canada's energy and electricity issues to and in climate and planetary healing, especially as over 81% of the country's emissions are energy related. And we're seeing a lot of the brunt of those impacts from emissions when it comes to climate change impacts as well. So Indigenous communities and other communities are getting kind of like that two-prong approach of industrial health impacts to now climate change impacts, and it's all kind of compiling right now. And yes, furthering on that energy generation and grids in so-called Canada, really touching on what a grid is, devices that generate electricity, devices that conduct and safely regulate the flow of electricity, and devices that consume electricity. And I just want to touch on that communities that are not connected to the broader electricity network are considered off-grid. And over 170 communities are considered off-grid in so-called Canada. And in so many cases, do not directly benefit from energy extraction projects on their lands and territories, and actually are facing the brunt of diesel impacts when that's all they're able to use. And yeah, energy conservation and efficiency, really understanding the supply, the consumption, the baseline, demand management, what solutions can be brought forth, and how to monitor. I will just touch, this is the first step when it comes to any kinds of projects, really focus on this. And this is where that health component really comes in, because a lot of these projects go beyond just emissions. And yeah, I just wanted to provide this graphic that is central to the Just Transition Guide and to that path forward of designing our projects. When you think about what Melina was just talking about, the sacred circle, the sacred hoop, this is our sacred circle when it comes to the just transition. And it's a very holistic approach to projects. And it isn't just about design and engineering, which people think about right away, but it's about energy justice and self-determination and restoring traditions and decolonization and sovereignty. It's all very interconnected and central to actually building a just transition. To our section 3, renewable energy project steps, which is actually part of Melina's master's thesis at University of Victoria. And this is where a lot of the Just Transition Guide first started and blossomed within Melina's master's thesis. And all the different project steps that are really central to being able to implement our solutions forth, from community visioning and building that community presence and autonomy within projects, to identifying project locations, making sure it isn't on sacred sites or burial sites, or where our medicines are, or in our agricultural harvest lands, right? We really need to be thoughtful about where we're placing these projects, to an interconnection application. And so going back to that grid conversation, how, if you want your project to be on grid and not off grid, how are you going to apply and put that design forth to the utility who manages the grid? And make sure that you can get your project on grid so that you can see the benefits through solar credits. So yeah, the interconnection application is a really big step to getting our projects online. To next, design and engineering. What is the best fit? Do I want a ground mounted system on the ground? Do I want it on my roof? Do I want it at the top of the pole system? Do I want bifacial solar panels that you can get sun on the other side of the panel, not just on the top? There's many different options you could make. And so it's really, this design and engineering section, yes, we need experts and contractors, but we also need the community's leadership within this to really design and be informed on the kind of design and projects that they want to put in their communities. To financing, construction, and fundraising, which is really a lot of what Sacred Earth Solar does, putting forth our project plans and writing lots of grant proposals and trying to get these projects funded. And a big thing that we're realizing is a lot of the time we're fundraising for the front of the project and the construction portion, but actually these projects have long lifespans. And so we really also need to be financing for the operation and maintenance of the next 25 to 30 years plus. Again, into number 6, operation and maintenance. So those 25 years plus, how do we have the capacity in our communities to maintain these systems over time? If something happens, can we do the diagnostic to understand what's wrong and where to fix it, right? These projects are like babies, and so we really need to take care of them and nourish them over time. And it isn't just one step forth in implementation, it's a lot longer than that. To even deepening that community visioning into actually workshops and deepening the lessons that we're learning, just as I showed you with the Sour Springs project, all the different community education sessions we've been having. And lastly, to ownership models and revenue generation, looking at what kind of model do we want to put forth our project, from a co-op model to community managed off-grid systems, to a revenue generating model, to community managed on-grid systems, hybrid models. Sacred Earth Solar has done both on-grid and off-grid projects. And Melina will be supporting a revenue generating project within her own community of Little Buffalo, that they're implementing a 1.5 megawatt solar farm. So it's really exciting to even see that transition and to see the evolution of projects over time that really build the capacity and the revenue for our communities so that we don't have to be economic hostages. And this is just one example I wanted to give from my own community, because I didn't mention this, but Six Nations of the Grand River, we actually hold the largest renewable energy portfolio in the country. We hold over 1,000 megawatts of renewable energy, and we have about 18 projects of solar and wind assets. So it's very privileged positioning to see the capacity that my community's built within the larger grand scheme of energy generation in the country. And we are seeing the benefits also within building community revenue streams. So looking at a quote from Tabitha Curley, who was actually my mentor when I was 18 and got into renewable energy work. Not only does the solar and wind farm create renewable energy and a green economy, but all the funds that the Six Nations of the Grand River Development Corporation make go back to benefiting our community. We're able to invest in things like fire trucks, water line expansions, and housing developments for our people. And yes, we have felt that and seen that firsthand. Here's a fire truck in Six Nations that's been purchased by the Economic Development Trust Fund, and it's able to be 4 stories high now. I don't know if this is but we have a lot of fires in our community, house fires, forest fires, not necessarily wildfires, but a lot of it has to do actually with electricity or housing. And so it's something that's really special to us to be able to have the resources in place for emergencies at hand. To section 4, the good, the bad, the ugly. And this could be, Melina and I, for hours, but just for synopsis, this is where we really focus our work when we want to talk about what is renewable energy systems for a just transition, looking at the sun, solar PV, and solar thermal systems, so both for electricity and heating. To wind, onshore and offshore wind turbines. We see a lot of onshore, but we actually don't have any offshore projects in the country currently. To water, we specifically focus on run-of-the-river and micro hydropower systems, as we do not believe mega dams are clean energy. As one, there's been a lot of environmental health impacts from creating more methyl mercury in the rivers to the methane that actually comes from these projects as well, contributing to climate change. 4, to Earth itself and the geo-exchange systems and geothermal heat pumps that are making waves within the country right now by providing a new way of heating, heating is at the source of most emissions in the country. To plants, again, we really focus on that small scale, looking at small scale biomass systems, so maybe wood chips, waste, many different ways. Even your wood stove in your house can be considered small scale biomass. to mixed use energy, microgrids, and district energy systems. A lot of those remote communities that I had mentioned are on microgrids. And so they're not necessarily connected to the larger electricity network and have to build a grid for itself in their own community. And how can we make that grid healthy? To 7, again, bringing back what I was talking about earlier, renewable energy considerations. When we even are looking at implementing solar or wind turbines, what are these considerations that we need to make if we're still seeing some extraction within these projects themselves? And we really need to be informed on this. And then again, lastly, we do touch on the ugly, especially when it comes to uranium nuclear power, which I'm sure many of you know about and know that there's considerable health impacts when it comes to uranium nuclear power across the country, and especially in Ontario. As well as in other countries that are facing the extraction, but we're also seeing the disposal in Ontario. So from extraction to disposal, there's many impacts. And then again, mega dams, which I just touched on. And this is really a large focus, and it's a living document. So we're going to continue to build this out and add new ways of thinking and new different opportunities and solutions within the guide as well. And then section 5, the just transition is beyond renewable energy. Yes, we need to transition from fossil fuels to renewable energy, but we also need so much more, especially cultural revitalization and traditional teachings. What makes us who we are as Ungwe or Indigenous peoples, and we won't be able to see a just transition without being able to exert who we are and exert our sovereignty and our culture on our lands. To Indigenous food sovereignty. And I feel like that is probably a very large interest for many of you. I feel like nutrition has been a brunt of many Indigenous health impacts across the country because we've been unable to have access to our traditional foods. And so really revitalizing or protecting those practices in place that we're able to stay to our traditional diets. To eco housing, again, kind of bringing in that conversation of building healthy homes and homes that aren't necessarily extractive or exploitive, and really focusing on how to make them healthy, how to create optimal airflow, how to make sure that there's no moisture so that we can not have mold problems, right? I think we see a lot of housing impacts, impacts to our housing, especially on reserve, that contribute to a lot of health issues. So it's very important to us when it comes to eco housing, and all of these different steps that they're also included, and that this list isn't exhaustive as well. And there's many different areas that contribute as well to a just transition that we will continue to build upon. And then last but not least, this is our last big section. We're looking at a policy for a just transition, focusing on Canada's energy policy landscape, that many of these policies are differing across provinces. And so we require just transition policies that are reactive to current socio-environmental health issues and proactive in supporting energy transition, food security, and sustainable housing. Reactive measures address costs to workers and community transitioning from fossil fuels. Proactive efforts are essential for moving towards clean energy, preventing worsening climate crisis impacts and social inequalities. So really much, instead of being reactive, being preventative, which I don't think we see a lot in our policy, but let's make the shift. We have the power to make the shift. And then, yes, we focus on policy successes in Indigenous communities, focusing on that wisdom from communities. Here's just one of the examples from Keith Julius, and he worked on the narrows in the hydro facility. This project is the perfect example of a paradigm shift in energy system, yet again led by First Nations to meet the community's needs while never taking more than necessary, leaving the land in even better shape than how it was found. And I think that's really special because our projects have the power to be able to make those shifts on a larger level. And lastly, focusing on voices from our communities and the ideal future that we want. So just a few of our policy recommendations around key strategies. 1, building relationships, building partnerships, and enhancing collaboration for solutions. 2, capacity building, just as that training we were showing, and training in Melina's video of the Pitapin project. So supporting that sovereignty and self-sufficiency in our community so that we can maintain our own systems. To 3, equity-oriented policy, creating fair and just energy solutions, ones that are led by us for us. 4, procurement approaches, cultivating democratic energy systems, and procurement's really important. There's many different portions that come from project, and how are we making sure it's an equitable process to accessing all the different resources that come within the many different project steps. To 5, interrupting the status quo and decolonizing and centralizing energy systems. And I think that's probably my most favorite one, because we really, when we use our voice and are able to enter these spaces, I think we really have the opportunity and the privilege to interrupt that status quo and to make a difference and to speak on behalf of our communities and for our communities, in creating that sustainable change that we want to see. Lastly, our conclusion of section 7, a story of change. And some of our offerings to you, if you want to take a picture, you can also find this in the Just Transition Guide. But if you're interested in capacity building program, we highly recommend the following. We have renewable energy funding databases, Power to the People, as Melina touched on, the Indigenous Clean Energy Catalyst Program and Project Accelerator Program, Indigenous Climate Actions, Climate Leadership Training, Indigenous Clean Energy Network, if you just want to stay. We even have Indigenous youth programming that I work very closely with, as well as working with organizations like Soon Energy that support youth in this field, and renewables in remote communities, such as the many off-grid communities we see across the country. Final thoughts. I think for all of you, and I think Melina really created the basis of why we do this work, and how it's really centered within the health and well-being of our communities, and these solutions, and how we can push for solutions that focus on not just emissions, but also making sure that we're taking care of our aunties, we're taking care of our uncles, we're taking care of the coming faces, and we just want to make sure that we have healthy communities, healthy lands, healthy people, healthy animals, all of the rest of creation. And so, yeah, that's really the basis of why we do our work, is because we just have a lot of love and care for our people, and just want the next generations to be a whole lot healthier. And so, yeah, thank you so much. For more information on Sacred Earth Solar and the Just Transition Guide, please go to sacredearth.solar. And I'll pass it to Melina for some closing words.
Yeah, I know we wanted to do a short Q&A, so maybe I'll just pass it back to Dominique, and then see if there's any kind of last questions. I know we have about 12 minutes left, so happy to give it back to you, Dominique, and see if anyone has any Q&A for us.
Sure. Thank you both so much. That was so informative, and you guys do so much incredible work. It was so nice to hear like the whole background and everything behind it. I'm sure everyone learned a lot tonight. So if anybody has any questions, feel free to either raise your hand and we can unmute you, or type it in the chat. We'll try and get to them. We have about 10 more minutes. So I think Rob has his hand raised here. So if you want, you can unmute yourself, Rob.
Hello. Thank you very much for the presentation. I have very different lived experiences and very different background, but I think we share a lot of very similar values. So I think it's amazing. I have 2 questions. One question is, how do you deal with individuals like Stephen Buffalo? And then my second question is, a lot of our energy networks and utilities are extremely centralized. In Ontario, we have large nuclear power facilities, large dams, and long distance transmission, and they're very built around really monopolized central utilities. Clean energy is a huge change in that, and it totally takes away that monopoly from those groups. How do you manage to be a player in that, and how do you get past those adversities?
I can take a crack, Serena, and then you want to go? Okay. I'll start with the second one actually, because I think depending on what province you're in, and what kind of policy that province has, sometimes it's easier to take a crack at it. Like in terms of So say if you, because where I am now, so where I was before, I used to live in so-called British Columbia, that's BC Hydro monopoly, like you said. And then they're trying to decentralize the grid is very challenging when they're pushing mega dams like Site C, which many communities didn't agree with, you know, including myself and my partner, just like, you know, people fought against it, communities sued. And that was very challenging. And then there's other things that, so if you want to learn more about it, actually Power to the People does profile communities that have started to implement run of the river projects, but are small scale working. It's micro hydro. It's like not mega dams. It doesn't impact. It's actually First Nation led, where it works with the geology of the cliffs and all of the different type of kind of rock faces that exist and canyons that exist in BC. Couldn't really do that here in Alberta, but it works. The technology works with the landscape and then has lower impact because it just goes down like a penstock and moves turbines. So it's actually a lot less impact technology. And so Run of the River actually decentralizes that grid and actually does kind of help communities basically start developing their own projects as well as start developing their own revenue, start developing kind of what they want to see in the environmental assessments, the cultural assessments. So I would definitely recommend watching the episode of Kanaka Bar, Sea Salt Nation. We also went to Squamish Nation. So there's at least, and we are actually up in the north between the borders, very far north in Atlin, BC, but it's almost basically the Yukon. And so they've also put in around the river system. And so that actually helps communities kind of democratize, if you want to call that, or decentralize power. And then it brings electrons onto the grid from communities producing that. And so that kind of like helps kind of combat the monopolies. In Alberta, where I am, each grid system in provinces are different. So you're kind of dealing with different utilities and different companies and different governments and different policies. So each province is so different. So here it's decentralized, which makes it very challenging. I think there's like 40 companies that we're dealing with here in the province. So it makes it very complicated. And then also the Alberta government, right now, the current one, the previous Notley era, they actually started allowing for communities to get onto grid and produce projects and put 8 renewable energy programs in place and allowed for communities to get a power purchase agreement. And in Ontario, Serena can talk a little bit about, they had a feed-in tariff system, a Green Energy Act, which allowed for more communities to get onto grid. So it just really depends, unfortunately, on the province. They deal with the grid jurisdiction. So Serena, I don't know if you want to, I'll pass it back to you and then maybe we can go back to the first question after.
Yeah, no, you very much sum that up in a really, and even within my own community, policy is really central to that conversation. And that's why I find it really interesting. And I always say everyone plays a role within these conversations, and you can kind of find where your role is within a just transition, because policy and lawyers are very central as well to being able to push forward with our projects, because we have the Ontario Energy Act under Kathleen Wynne's jurisdiction when she put that through, especially with the coal power phase out. And that was a big thing that we saw within my own community during that coal power phase out of the Wynne government. It provided an opportunity of, okay, let's do things differently, right? And with the feed-in tariff program, we were able to get projects on grid, and especially in the tender calls that the utility had in the policy that was put forth with the Ontario Energy Act, there was specific components to projects in these tender calls that focus specifically on having Indigenous engagement and Indigenous leadership within projects. And so it takes a lot of different work and moving parts for people, but that's how we were able to get so many projects on the grid when it came to having those certain policies forward, and especially with just our presence in Ontario. And then the other thing, it kind of goes back to the other policy recommendation is relationships. Six Nations of the Grand River Development Corporation has a plethora of relationships across Ontario and even the country, specifically with Hydro One and the IESO, which is the energy regulator within Ontario. And so making sure that those relationships are nourished, and also there is a standing that our community is able to exert autonomy within that space. So that's kind of how we in Six Nations were able to get so many projects forth. But really, yeah, focusing on those relationships with the federal and provincial government, which I still think creates an uneven power dynamic. And that's probably my own critiques of the projects putting forth, especially because I'm doing a project with our traditional governance and we're not given the same graces as, say, the band council. But that's another fish to fry, and just the work that we keep doing of wanting to make good things even better and how we can really be critical still of the systems. And then I'll just touch on the first questions because I had to Google Stephen Buffalo, and then I'm like, oh, okay, Indian Resource Council. And that's really interesting to me because there is a lot of people within, and even within our own communities, that I think where we have to have these difficult conversations with, and and also that we aren't a like a monolithic kind of people. Like, we have many different perspectives across our people, and we do disagree on things, and we do come from different opportunities. And I just really, when I think of that though, um have different perspectives, because obviously I don't necessarily want to focus entirely. Obviously, I do focus entirely my work on that climate justice perspective, and I'm very much focused on the land back movement within my own community. But I also think, as Melina was talking with economic hostages, it is hard to pretty like critique our own community members because we each have our own way of trying to become unoppressed. And that is something that we're all trying to manage and try and find our own ways to liberation, even though that might look differently. So I do have grace for a lot of people who promote in our own communities these kinds of projects or ways forward. But then I also think there's the opportunity for conversation and making sure that our voices are heard and that we have that space to disagree. And I think that's really the basis of it, is we can disagree and we will disagree. And I think it's making sure that our communities at the end of the day have informed decisions, so that they are completely informed on the education and the projects that are being put forth, so that they can make these decisions. Because right now I think there's a lack of education. And I think, just one last thing, and this is coined from the Yellowhead Institute, there's a lot of red washing. So a red washing is a term from the Yellowhead Institute. It's kind of like greenwashing that puts Indigenous peoples within these certain fields. And because there's an Indigenous person within these projects, then it's consensual, or it is okay to go forth. And that's not necessarily the case, because each of our communities, and Melina and I, most likely different, have our own decision-making processes and like traditional governance and ways of knowing that actually inform these projects. So we're seeing a lot of red washing, and sometimes I think with these organizations such as like the Indian Resource Council or like First Nations Major Projects Coalition, there's a bit of red washing within that context of still pushing forward the unideal projects that we see in the country. But yeah, I'll let Melina answer the other question.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's also just continuing to uplift our voices and just allowing people, like Serena said, to have difference of opinions, just like there is across, the different parties in Canada, or different, different Canadians across the country. I feel like I just keep doing my work, and I continue to just keep saying what I need to say, even if it's uncomfortable. And I'm from so-called Alberta, so for me as an quote unquote environmentalist or an Indigenous rights advocate, a lot of times I've been definitely in the minority, but that doesn't, I've been doing this for 20 years. So I just continue to have that voice, and uplifting the voice and uplifting the voices of many people that I've worked with, many communities that I've worked with. I think is why I continue to do the work. And, because like those voices are going to exist and kind of go along, and we're just allowed to, I don't kind of back down, I guess. And I also agree, it's about constructive dialogue, whenever possible. And it's also that creates better ways of an understanding, because even within my own community or the other communities I work with, even communities that I'm from the north, like, I'll still have conversations with people, even if I disagree with them, and I've had to do that even with non-Indigenous peoples. Like I testified before US Congress, against the KXL pipeline, and me and one other person, partially out of like 7 basically white men, and it was like me as the sole young person, Indigenous person and woman that had the dissenting view. And that's just the way it is sometimes. And I was of course the only one from the actual tar sands impact zone. So I think it's just continuing to use your voice and not backing down, but just also trying to be as respectful and as constructive, I feel like, is what gets us to a better place.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you both. Would we have time for one more question? Is that okay? If
Yeah, I
we
did
have
one.
time. Okay, so well, if anybody has a question, whoever's first. And you can either type it in the chat, raise your hand, and if you don't have questions, that's okay too.
It's also 8:30 at your, and it gets an EST, so I'm.
Yeah, yeah. Or Alicia there, so you can unmute yourself.
Yeah. Hi, I would normally show my face, but I'm not feeling the best. And you're right, it's 8 o'clock, so I'll spare you all. I was just wondering what your thoughts are in terms of environmental waste and just like even electricity in the hospital system, because the like us specifically, like I come from the hospital and like a lot of us are nurses, and I actually did my first degree in geography, so this like all the things you're talking about are definitely up my alley, like, and I'm so happy to kind of regain this kind of interest and knowledge, especially from an indigenous lens. But now being in nursing, we see so much waste, and maybe some of our colleagues here can say and especially for like more disease prevention and IPAC, and we always want to make sure that we're not transferring diseases. But as a result, we use more electricity than we should. We waste things more than we should, and it's just sometimes we just have no other option other than just wasting. And I don't know if either of you have come across literature or even different organizations, or even if your thoughts. I'm just kind of trying to pick your brains around this topic and issue as well, just to kind of explore a little bit more.
I haven't actually looked into it just because of my area of research is different, but I could like I've, every time I anything that's throwaway, we have such a throwaway culture that I think it irks me just as an Indigenous person. And I also understand I have a little bit of OCD, so I can also understand like the sanitary and the sterilization, which I super appreciate when I go into a hospital. But yeah, I feel like there probably is research out there. I don't know if anyone else on the call has looked into that, but Serena, have you seen anything?
Not necessarily around waste. I think, and this is just small tidbit, but I went to Western University and we have a hospital that is on location of our university, the university hospital. And the hospital is one of London's top sources of electricity usage, as well as emissions, especially with the power generation station. And so for a lot, I was I was one of the co-founders of Western University's Climate Crisis Coalition. And a big part of that was divestment from fossil fuel assets, but also in the integration of decarbonization on campus. And so with that being said, it comes back, I guess, to the relationships and also like the power that we have within our own institutions and spaces to be able to make the changes that we want to see. Because I think looking at it from like a holistic level, the hospital is part of the community, right? And so how are they building those bridges between the hospital and the community to really focus on like a shared vision for what was needed? And so to the waste aspect, I don't necessarily know, but I think that's connected to like a larger conversation. And I know Melina's done it looking at the film industry, but for the energy conversation, I really do believe hospitals like use a ton of electricity, and it's vital to have that electricity. So how are you engaging within your hospital spaces though, but engaging in the larger community to advocate for renewable energy solutions within the spaces that are using from the grid? And especially like Ontario, as Rob talked about, like 60% of the energy that in Ontario is coming from nuclear, and that's what's sourcing most of our hospitals because we need that baseload energy there. So how are we looking at alternative energy sources? And I think that's just, I will mention the power of like coming together and the power of community and building these kinds of spaces, especially what you guys have for the Ontario Nurses for the Environment. These are the type of conversations that your group can specifically focus on, and that you have the power to really bridge that dialogue. And so, yeah, my whole thing, and Rob said he did take my course around connecting for climate change action and connecting for environments. That's really, we need to come together to build these solutions and have everyone, but you guys have the most knowledge, right? When you're in those hospital spaces. So really taking the knowledge that you guys see and seeing where you can implement those solutions. But yes, I will further more research on that. And I see Melina added some sources in there. But yeah, thank you for the great question. And I hope that provided some thinking.
No, that was great. And I think I'm going to definitely use more of that just guide. I'm going to learn a lot more and, definitely engage more in community to advance forward. And thank you so much. I really appreciate both your insights and knowledge.
Alicia, I can also jump in on this as well.
Oh, yeah.
So in Canada, 4.6% of greenhouse gas emissions are from healthcare, and globally it's 5.2%. And worldwide, healthcare as an industry is the fifth largest greenhouse gas emitting. Like if we were a country as an industry, we'd be the fifth largest country in greenhouse gas emissions. And based on a Lancet study done in the UK for NHS, about 2/3 of greenhouse gas emissions are coming from our supply chain, our medications, and our medical equipment. So yes, there's a building infrastructure aspect to it as well as a transportation aspect, but most of it is actually what's coming in. And then all that stuff that comes in then ends up in the landfill. So some of the work that we're trying to do, we're partnering with the Canadian Coalition for Green Healthcare, as well as Kane and Kate. And we've been having discussions with with Health Canada. We've had a couple of discussions with some assistant deputy ministers from Health Canada and Treasury Board, but we've also been in discussion with Accreditation Canada and Health Services Organization. We're trying to push for a standard on through Accreditation Canada for sustainable procurement. So sustainable procurement or green procurement or net zero procurement, like they have it with NHS in the UK, 10 or 20%, depending, would be on sustainability criteria, and then 80 to 90% is on cost when you're doing a purchase. And from that idea, putting that into a standard, and then hopefully, if that standard's there with Accreditation Canada, all of the hospitals and health organizations would then opt into it, and then we'd have enough market force to get manufacturers to make greener products. So we're doing work in that direction, and I'd love to have you on board with that if you want. And in London, to touch on what Serena's doing, there's somebody in London from the university, what is it called? University Health Center? Or University Hospital. And he's been fairly involved with the sustainable procurement talks, and he works more with the facilities, but yeah, they're in on it. So we're working towards something there.
No, that was amazing. And I just said in the chat, you'll definitely see more of me.
Amazing. We're actually looking for more people to join our exec team.
Come hang out with us. We're fun. So thank you, everyone. We are gonna end it tonight, but thank you everyone for coming out. Thank you, Serena and Melina and Rob, for jumping in there. I hope you all learned a lot, gained some new perspectives. And yeah, we hope to see you at our next event. Definitely check out the Just Transition Guide. Check out Sacred Earth Solar and ONEG on our social media. And I hope you all have a wonderful night. Thank you so much. And the recording will be posted on our socials as well.
Yeah,
Thank
go.
you. Night.
Thank you. Bye.
Good night.